The house in Westport glowed with candles and garlands, but I barely noticed. My place was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, knives flashing against the cutting board. Through the doorway, I could hear Sabina laughing, her voice rising above the music as she held court in the living room. Guests leaned toward her, captivated, while I moved quietly among roasting pans and simmering pots. It had always been this way. At Thanksgiving, while other girls my age slipped out to football games or curled on couches with cousins, I was the one assigned to carve turkeys and refill wine glasses. At graduation parties, Sabina sparkled in new dresses while I kept trays of hors d'oeuvres moving. Even at my father's retirement dinner, my mother had tapped her glass and announced that Sabina, our star, organized everything, though I had done the planning, cooking, and cleanup alone. My mother liked to say I had a steady hand in the kitchen. What she meant was that I was useful there, out of sight. The guests came to admire Sabina's wit, my father's golf trophies, and my mother's immaculate entertaining. They never thought to ask who kept the food hot or the glasses full. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed photograph from Sabina's engagement party. 200 guests had toasted under chandeliers while I had balanced trays until my arms shook. In the photo, Sabina beamed in her sequined gown, my parents beside her. In the far edge of the frame, I stood blurred, a tray of canapes in my hands, almost part of the furniture. That night in Westport, as laughter swelled and I wiped butter from my palms, I felt the old weight settle again. The script had been written years ago, but soon, I knew, the next scene would not play out the way they expected. In my Manhattan condo, I folded blouses into my suitcase with practiced precision. The ticket on my desk glowed with promise, a flight to Fort Lauderdale. Departure the evening of December 24th. My phone buzzed, the screen flashing Mother. I hesitated, then answered. Tamsin. Your sister's friends are spending Christmas here, only 20 people. Deirdre began, her voice brisk, as if she were assigning chores to household staff. Before I could respond, she continued. 7 main courses, 10 sides. Use the good china. These are executives from Pinnacle. Do not embarrass us. Her tone was sharp enough to slice through the silence of my apartment. I stared at the neat stack of business blazers on my bed. To her, I was still the daughter with idle hands and endless time, a servant on call. She smirked through the line, reminding me of Sabina's importance, her connections that benefit the family. If only she knew. On the counter sat the leather folder embossed in gold stellar events. For 5 years, I had built the company in silence 3 locations, 50 employees, a client list that included luxury resorts and Fortune 500 firms. Tomorrow's meeting in Florida was not a whim. It was the culmination of years of strategy, and the contract on the table was worth $2 million. I held the phone tighter. My mother rattled off wine pairings and dessert selections. Oblivious. She spoke of Pinnacle as though Sabina might impress them, never imagining that I had already catered their retreats and was about to stand before their board as a peer. When the call ended, I exhaled slowly. On the counter, I placed a neat note with 3 emergency caterers' numbers and, beside it, one of my own business cards. A quiet gesture they would likely ignore. I zipped my suitcase and slid the folder inside. Tomorrow, I would no longer be their invisible cook. And as I set the luggage by the door, I knew the next call would not come from my family, but from the life I had chosen. I carried my packed suitcase to the living room and set it beside the window, the lights of Central Park flickering beyond. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the city hum, remembering all the small humiliations that had become the foundation of my family's story about me. Last summer, I had driven up to Westport unannounced, hoping for a quiet night in my childhood room. I opened the door to find it unrecognizable. The pale blue walls were still there, but the bed and bookshelves were gone. In their place, rows of garment racks sagged under Sabina's blazers and cocktail dresses. Boxes labeled Winter Collection crowded the corners. My trophies from debate team and the framed sketch I had won in high school art class had been packed into bins in the basement. When I asked, my mother barely looked up from her tablet. Sabina needs the space. She's building her career. You don't use this room anymore. The second receipt came at a dinner at the club. My father introduced Sabina to his golf partner as our success story. She runs her own PR firm in Stamford. Then he turned to me with a faint smile. And this is Tamsin. She's between opportunities. The words burned. That same morning, I had signed a contract worth $500,000. My staff had toasted me with champagne. But to my father, I was still drifting, a child without direction. Their narrative required me to be small, to explain away my apartment and my car. They leaned on the fiction of a grandmother's savings, as though I were coasting on old money rather than generating my own. None of them ever asked about my work, my travel, or how I paid for the life I lived. They didn't want answers that would upset their version of reality. I opened my laptop and pulled up the payroll for the month 50 salaries. Holiday bonuses approved. Vendors paid on time. On another tab glowed a trade article naming Stellar Events, a quiet revolutionary in luxury catering. I closed the screen, slid the laptop into my bag, and waited for the car to JFK. The car had barely merged onto FDR Drive when my phone lit up again. Deirdre's name glared across the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but habit won. "You cannot be serious," she snapped the moment I answered. "I've told everyone you're preparing dinner. If you abandon us, it will be a humiliation." Her words rolled over me, familiar as the clang of old chains. I kept my tone steady. "I have a business trip. Mother, I'm flying out tonight." "A business trip," she laughed, sharp and cold. "Tamsin, stop pretending. What business could you possibly have on Christmas Eve?" I didn't answer. The silence seemed to provoke her further. "You've always been selfish. Your sister's future depends on this dinner. Family comes first. Family comes first when you need something from me," I said quietly. She gasped. Then her voice rose to a shrill pitch. "If you leave, don't bother coming back." I ended the call before she could continue. My hands trembled, but not with fear. It was something closer to release. The phone rang again. This time Sabina, "Look," she said, her tone falsely sweet. "If money's the issue, I'll pay you. $200. Just come cook. Please don't ruin this." I almost laughed. $200. My day rate for personal chef work alone was $5,000. "No," I said. Her voice hardened. "You're dead to us if you walk away." "I already was," I replied, and hung up. The driver pulled into the departure lane at JFK. I handed over my bag and checked in without looking back at my phone. Still, as I walked toward the gate, a flicker of fear coiled in my chest. What if Victoria heard their lies before she heard my truth? What if my silence had left too much room for them to define me? I steadied myself as the boarding call echoed through the terminal. I had chosen this path long before tonight. With each step down the jetway, my hands shook not from doubt, but from the weight of finally claiming freedom. While my plane taxied down the runway, the house in Westport was unraveling. Later, I would piece together the story from messages and second-hand reports, each one sharper than the last. By 6 o'clock, Deirdre had realized nothing was prepared. The counters gleamed with untouched pans. The refrigerator held only butter and eggs, and the pantry was bare of the lavish ingredients she had promised. She called every restaurant along the post road, from Norwalk to Fairfield, but kitchens were shuttered for the holiday. Caterers she had once snubbed declined politely. The silence of empty ovens grew louder by the minute. Guests began to arrive just after 7, coats brushed free of snow, their voices full of expectation, neighbors from Stamford, colleagues from Darien, and, most importantly, Victoria Chin of Pinnacle Hospitality, all ushered into a living room glowing with crystal and candlelight. My mother tried to stall with cocktails, insisting that dinner was slightly delayed, but within the hour, Sabina was frantically dialing delivery numbers, voice cracking as she begged for anything edible. At last, a handful of delivery drivers appeared, arms stacked with cardboard boxes. The sight must have been unbearable for Deirdre, who had bragged for weeks about her daughter's culinary skill. Yet she pressed the silver trays into service, sliding slices of pizza onto Waterford plates as if presentation might disguise failure. The air smelled not of rosemary and roast, but of pepperoni and grease. Sabina, ever desperate, attempted her pitch between bites. She cornered Victoria near the mantel, gesturing toward a mock-up of her PR firm's brochure while cardboard boxes slumped on the mahogany sideboard. "We could expand your brand presence in the Northeast," she said brightly, her voice wobbling as another guest opened a pizza box behind her. A cousin, phone in hand, captured the moment Sabina mid-sentence, a stack of Domino's boxes piled against the family portrait above the mantel. In that photo, taken years ago at Sabina's engagement, my parents smiled while I hovered in the blurred background with a tray. Now the past and present stood side by side, both exposing who we truly were. The photo began to circulate before dessert was even mentioned, and while Westport dined on disappointment, I prepared for dinner of my own in Fort Lauderdale. The resort in Fort Lauderdale shimmered with quiet elegance, glass walls opening to the Atlantic and tables set with linens that whispered of precision. I arrived early, reviewing my notes while the Pinnacle executives took their seats. By the time Victoria Chen entered, the room shifted, every conversation lowering in deference. She was smaller than I had imagined, sharp-eyed, carrying herself with the ease of someone accustomed to rooms bending toward her. "I apologize for being late," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I just flew in from the most unprofessional party I have ever attended." The words landed like stones in still water. I folded my hands, steady, waiting. Supposed to be a Christmas Eve dinner in Connecticut, 25 guests, executives, investors. The hostess promised an elaborate meal prepared by her daughter. Victoria shook her head. We walked in to find an empty kitchen, frantic excuses, and finally pizza boxes on Waterford crystal. Unbelievable! A ripple of laughter moved around the table, though Victoria did not join it. She looked at me directly, as if testing whether I would flinch. "That must have been uncomfortable," I said, keeping my tone calm. Consistency matters. Guests remember the smallest cracks. Her mouth curved slightly. "Exactly. And worse. The hostess spent the evening complaining about the missing daughter, called her unreliable, unstable. To do that in front of business partners was astounding. Inside, my stomach clenched, but I kept my expression smooth. It tells you more about the host than the absent guest," I replied. Victoria studied me for a long moment before nodding. "You understand. Too many people overlook professionalism when personal drama intrudes." The conversation turned then to strategy, logistics, expectations for service quality. I leaned in, not as a supplicant, but as a peer, outlining standards my company had already exceeded at other resorts. By the time dessert arrived, Victoria's earlier frustration had softened into interest. She didn't yet know that the chaos she had witnessed belonged to my family, but she had seen me hold composure, offer clarity, and speak in the language of solutions. And in the morning, the boardroom would demand even more. Morning light spilled across the boardroom table, catching on the polished glass and the neat rows of water glasses. I stood at the head with my presentation open, voice steady as I walked Victoria and her team through projections, staffing models, and event strategies. Every slide landed the way I had rehearsed: concise, precise, undeniable. When I closed the deck, the room held a rare stillness. Then an assistant slipped in, tablet in hand. "Ms. Chen, you should see this." Victoria's brow furrowed as she scanned the screen. A photograph glowed against the glass pizza boxes stacked on mahogany, a family portrait looming above. The caption read, "When pedigree fails, Papa John's steps in." It had been posted to LinkedIn, already gathering hundreds of comments. The tag below read, "Rook Family, Westport." Victoria looked from the tablet to me, then back again. "Rook," she repeated slowly. "That was your mother's house." I did not hesitate. "Yes. Deirdre is my mother." The silence thickened. One executive cleared his throat. Another set his pen down. Victoria leaned back. "Your mother told everyone last night her daughter was unreliable. Yet here you stand. Why should I trust you over her words? I met her eyes. Because results don't lie. Ask me anything about scaling, operations, or risk. My record speaks louder than her narrative." She paused, then asked about contingency planning for a multi-resort event during hurricane season. I outlined protocols, vendor redundancies, and insurance safeguards without missing a beat. When I finished, she exhaled and closed the tablet. That's what I needed. Her gaze swept the room, then returned to me. "Gentlemen, I think we've found our partner." The contract was slid across the table, gold pinnacle letterhead gleaming. I signed my name with a steady hand, the ink drying as though sealing not just a deal, but a new truth. Outside the glass walls, the Atlantic shimmered, and I knew the call that followed would carry shockwaves all the way back to Connecticut. The ink on the contract was barely dry when Victoria excused herself, phone already in hand. Through the glass wall, I watched her pace, calm but deliberate. She pressed the call button, waited, and then said with cool authority, "Mrs. Rook, this is Victoria Chen. I'm calling to thank you for hosting me last night. Unfortunately, it was a disappointment. But I thought you should know I've just signed a partnership with your daughter, Tamsin Rook, CEO of Stellar Events." Even from across the room, I could sense the silence on the other end. Victoria's expression did not change as she added, "Yes, that daughter." Then she listened, nodded once, and ended the call. A moment later, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "Your mother fainted." Victoria returned to the table, set her phone aside, and smiled faintly. "Shall we make this public?" She snapped a photo of us standing with the signed contract, champagne flutes raised. Within minutes, the image was live on LinkedIn, thrilled to announce Pinnacle Hospitality's partnership with Stellar Events and its brilliant CEO, Tamsin Rook. "We look forward to elevating guest experiences together." She tagged my company, Pinnacle, and deliberately Deirdre Rook's charity profile. By the time the meeting wrapped, my notifications were surging, congratulatory notes from industry leaders, inquiries from journalists, and a string of bewildered messages from Westport acquaintances who had just watched the story upend itself online. In the tidy world my mother had cultivated, appearances were currency. At luncheons, she was the patroness, the woman whose daughters represented refinement and success. Now the very circles she depended on for status were scrolling past the image of her invisible child celebrated as a CEO, and the story she had polished for years was collapsing in real time. While the tide rose against her in Connecticut, I closed my laptop in Florida, knowing the wave had only just begun to crest. In the weeks that followed, the consequences landed one after another. Sabina's firm lost 2 of its biggest accounts. Both citing misalignment of values after the holiday debacle made its rounds. She tried to explain it away as bad timing, but in truth, the photos of pizza boxes on Waterford Crystal had traveled further than she ever imagined. Deirdre, once the prized board member of every charity committee in Fairfield County, was politely rotated off. The reasons were couched in phrases like fresh direction and new leadership. But everyone knew. Colin called me one evening, his voice quieter than I remembered. "I should have spoken sooner," he admitted. "I let your mother's story define you because it was easier than confronting her. That was cowardice. I see it now. I didn't rush to forgive him, but I acknowledged the weight it must have taken for him to say it. Meanwhile, Stellar Events surged forward. Victoria became not just a client, but an advocate, opening doors to partnerships I had only dreamed of. Within a month, I signed contracts worth $10 million combined, opportunities that stretched us to our limit. I hired 20 new staff members, expanding our kitchen teams and operations crew, and still the waiting list grew 8 months for peak season, sometimes longer. One afternoon, an email arrived from Cornell's School of Hotel Administration. They invited me to deliver a keynote lecture titled Building Success Without Permission. I stared at the message for a long time, remembering how my parents had once called my dream of applying there unrealistic. Now the invitation was mine to accept. As my company flourished and my voice found new ground, I realized the applause was finally for me. And still, there remained one conversation left unfinished. 3 months later, we met in a quiet restaurant off Columbus Avenue, far from the manicured lawns of Westport. I arrived first, sliding a single sheet of paper onto the table. When they walked in smaller, subdued, I gestured for them to sit. "These are my terms," I said. "Equal respect. No more servant roles. Public acknowledgement of who I am. Genuine apologies. Therapy. Together and apart. Non-negotiable." Deirdre's eyes filled, but she didn't argue. "I was envious," she admitted. "I kept you small because I couldn't bear that you might surpass the life I'd planned for you." Sabina looked down at her hands. "I was jealous. Mom made me feel special by making you invisible, and I clung to it." Colin finally met my gaze. "I chose silence. It was easier to let your mother's story stand than to challenge her. That made me complicit. I let their words hang before I spoke. If we rebuild, it's as equals, nothing less." They nodded, chastened, unsure. Weeks later, I hosted them at my condo for the first time. The dining table overlooked Central Park, but I did not cook. My staff from Stellar Events prepared and served a flawless meal. The invoices addressed directly to Deirdre. She signed without complaint. Sabina asked careful questions about the menu, no longer assuming authority. Colin raised a glass quietly, more proud than performative. When the evening ended, I walked them to the door. In my hand was a single key, the only one I kept on my ring. It wasn't just to my apartment, it was to my boundaries, my choices, my life. And as the door clicked shut behind them, I knew which ones would remain open and which would stay locked.